Anyway, this, article obviously garnered like a massive amount of international attention,
Mhm.
and people started emailing us from all over the world. I remember, although I'm loath to say it now, but Russell Brand sort of shared it on his Twitter, and that got a lot of attention. And it was quite surreal. I remember standing. It's really surreal, and you're exposed to this massive amount of criticism, and being called ideologues and idiots and everything
Mhm.
else. And yeah, I think it was pretty stressful, to be honest, looking back on it. The financial crisis, I think, was something that would I would directly blame economists for. And it seems to be having a massive impact, more so than most ideas in economics, mainstream or heterodox. So I'm really happy because, climate change now is the single biggest challenge we face. And I just can't understand how you could possibly write that. These are two Nobel Prize winning economists. It just shows you how little economists know about.
So I'll jump straight into it. When you started the post-crash economic society, like at what point did you realize there was a need for that? Like at what point in your degree did you feel like, you know what, I think we need to do something about the way we're being taught?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could personally claim any credit at all for a kind of road to Damascus moment where I was like, oh my God, we need to start the post-crash society. But
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't me that started it. I joined very early on. But Joe, Katrina, Zach, Maeve, those people, they started it, and Ricken, I think, as well, and a couple of others maybe. And it had been going for, 6 months, in a piecemeal form, I think, before Joe. I think the first thing I saw was of it was Joe coming to one of our lectures and doing one of those announcements, that societies do, and most of them kind of wash over you. But I'd been having those thoughts myself for a very long time, and indeed, I'd been blogging about them pseudonymously under the handle Unlearning Economics, on my old blog when I was an undergraduate. And but the thing is, I didn't really. Um, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's a very British attitude. Maybe it's just me, but I was very much just like keep your head down, get on with it, pass the courses, and I didn't really see the opportunity or need for political action. I didn't really understand what that was in a way. Obviously I could I could see that it happened, but I didn't ever think it would be something that I needed to do. So I would never have had that impetus were it not for other people who, serendipitously, or well, maybe not serendipitously, maybe it was just the zeitgeist, right? But they came to the same conclusions as me, and not just in Manchester, right? It was happening. It was happening everywhere. All of these students were very dissatisfied with what they taught. They studied economics for very clear reasons, which was that I want to make sense of the world, but the world seemed basically absent from our degrees when we were learning. And yeah, actually being able to put this into action, like I said, hadn't occurred to me. But then Joe gave his little talk, and I thought it was pretty interesting, and it was quite funny. Joe's very warm, if you've ever met him, so it was sort of quite appealing. And I thought, well, I'll go over to their first event, and I went to their first event. It was run partially by the Bank of England. I think it was called our Economics Graduates Fit for Purpose, or
Mm-hmm.
something like that. And I went to that, and then they said after that we're doing interviews to join the society. Then then I went along to the interview, and that was when I sort of realized that you could actually group together and start to try and change things instead of just keeping it to yourself and ranting anonymously on the internet.
So when you did join and started like campaigning and as a society, obviously there was quite a lot of impact that it led to with kind of
Mm.
newspapers talking about it, etc. But as you were getting to that stage, what are the challenges you faced? Did you face any kind of pushback?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just talking about this yesterday with someone, and it's really interesting to reflect on because one of the big watershed moments for us was in late 2013,
Hmm.
which was my third year of university because I joined in second year. And we got coverage in the Guardian. Aditya Chakraborty wrote an article about economic students rebel against free market syllabus, I think was the headline. Now this was a very clickbaity headline. It wasn't quite what we stood for. There was definitely an overlap with it, and there was a thing about free market capitalism at the root of this and how it had failed in 2008. But we were kind of calling for something a little bit more nuanced than that. And it was much more about the curriculum and just engaging with the 2008 crisis, not having a preset conclusion about what caused it. But anyway, this, article obviously garnered like a massive amount of international attention.
Hmm.
And people started emailing us from all over the world. I remember, although I'm loath to say it now, but Russell Brand sort of shared it on his Twitter, and that got a lot of attention. And it was quite surreal. I remember standing near the library in the courtyard. What's the big glass building called? I forget its name now. The one that people
Um,
study in.
Alan Gilbert
Alan Gilbert, yeah, I
or
was just
AJ.
outside that with
Mm.
a couple of the people in the society, and I was feeling very energized. It was very much a rush, uh, like that I experienced, a very noticeable, like clear rush on a specific day. I was like, oh my God, like this is amazing, but also pretty wild. And then, like you said, did we get pushback? Yeah, we did. We got loads of it. And what I was saying yesterday to this guy, it was actually the editor. I bumped into the editor of my book, The Econocracy, yesterday, and we were discussing it. And I was like, wow, that's like that level of international criticism to be exposed to. These students don't know what they're talking about. They can't do maths. They're just rabid Marxists, blah 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 blah. All the usual stuff. They're ignorant of the literature and stuff, which, by the way, I always found a really funny response to say that we're ignorant of economics. It's like, whose fault is that, by the way? Like, for academics to say that to us, it's like, then you're not teaching us properly. But anyway,
Mhm.
um, so yeah, we got all these responses and like high level critiques. You're talking
Yeah.
about people like Simon Wren Lewis, who, for the record, I have a lot of respect for, but writing about you, and like he's the dude's a full professor at Oxford, right? And you're just a bunch of 20-year-olds. You don't really know what's going on, not just in economics, but like in life in general. And so it's really surreal, and you're exposed to this massive amount of criticism, and being called ideologues and idiots and everything
Hmm.
else. And yeah, I think it was pretty stressful, to be honest, looking back on it. And I think it's really sad that it inspired that kind of reaction. Now, I do want to underscore, because I'm sounding a bit negative, a lot of the reaction was positive, right? And including from some academics and including from some academics at Manchester. So I don't want to ignore that. But it was with some of the pushback we got. I look back on it and I'm like, come on, you're a grown man, because it was mostly men.
Yeah.
But you're a grown man. You know what I mean? Like, can you not take a bit of criticism from your students if you're not teaching them about the actual economy? Like, come on, like, meet them halfway. But unfortunately, that's not always what happens. So, from then we were very widely known, and a lot of what we did was political, right? In not in the sense of a local activist group, but in a sense of you have to be careful what you put out on social media. We've had, without wanting to digress too much, but we've had issues with like local groups in Italy, and one of the leaders of the local group tweeted support for like killing a local candidate. He was like, take this guy down, and then we had to like release a statement. And you know what I mean? It's just
Mm.
like that kind of stuff. It's like it's really weird because you're so young, and it's unexpected and sudden.
Yeah.
But I guess that is just the fact that we did capture a zeitgeist. It felt like the 2008 financial crisis had happened. It had been really horrible. It felt like austerity was underway, the eurozone crisis, and people were feeling like nothing had changed, right? And one of the places nothing really had changed was economics curricula, and that was so noticeable that we thought we should say something, and inevitably you are going to get pushback. But I think when you take a look over the long term, you know, the the debate was with caveats. One, we were right that economics education wasn't fit for purpose, and there have been major changes to it. Those aren't exactly in line with what we would like to see, and there's more to be done. But I think over time, a lot of academics came to see that there were major problems with the degrees, and with the discipline more broadly. And economics just seems to be in a perpetual state of reckoning.
So you mentioned like something I find really interesting. How at the end of the day you were 20-year-olds. In this kind of world of like the adults, you know. How do you go about like the imposter syndrome? Because like a lot of people make the argument that students don't know what's best for them until they graduate, or like you know how it's like parents know what's best for their kids better than they know what's good for them. How do you go about that whole like side of things?
I mean, I think imposter syndrome. I don't ever remember feeling imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
And I think that is hopefully not arrogance. I think it's something to do with being young,
Yeah.
too young to really, like I was trying to say earlier, like young to really understand what's happening, right?
Mhm.
And also excited. It was very exciting. It was very invigorating. So you were doing all these things, and we were going to meetings with the department heads, and we prepared. We had meetings about the meeting. We
Mhm.
prepared. We weren't like complacent. We did appreciate it, and we took it seriously, for sure. And I think maybe they were a little bit surprised by how seriously we took it, because if you contrast us with like other student societies, right, who just like go to Amsterdam or whatever once a year, like it's not the same. We had weekly meetings, so we really tried. We put a lot of effort, and we produced a report in 2013, right, about the state of economics education at Manchester, kind of spearheaded by Joe Earl, and all of us contributed to it in one way or another. And yeah, so I guess we just kind of did the work. But again, I want to stress that we were very unaware of how of the role that we were being thrust into. It felt like we weren't experiencing, at least I wasn't experiencing imposter syndrome, because to experience imposter syndrome, you have to feel like you're in a place where you shouldn't be. And I didn't realize the place I was in. Looking back, I can be like, wow, yeah, you were an imposter in a way. But I don't know, it just didn't feel like that at the time, at least for me. I can't speak for everyone else.
I think that's a good thing because then I guess if you feel confident in what you're doing, then you just spearhead through.
I mean,
Uh,
I was always just like laser focused. And
mhm.
this is why I didn't see the need for political action, or didn't understand that, because I was always laser focused on the economics, right? So I would just like, that was my role in the society. I would like write the blog post or write the proposal or help to put something together, kind of what is neoclassical mainstream economics, a question like that, right? That was my role to answer that. So I just was always, a bit of a kind of technical role, and I just did that. I just produced those critiques and those arguments, right? I didn't necessarily think about it in a broader sense.
Um, on that note of curriculum reform,
Hmm.
so a big part of what you guys were like advocating for was critical thinking, especially in the context of
Yeah.
pluralism. Realistically, how do you think something like that can actually be integrated in a 3-year economics course? What were they kind of what were you advocating for? Like, were you advocating for anything specific, and what kind of was that?
Mm. Yeah, so I mean, in our report that I mentioned, and in the Econocracy later, which was followed similar logic, we defined a question an exam question which asked the student to demonstrate critical thinking as one which could have more than one possible answer, more than one possible valid answer. A good example: what caused the Great Depression? I think there's something of an emergent consensus that monetary policy got us out of the Great Depression. Still a bit of debate over, what exactly caused it. Should we blame the 1929 Wall Street crash? Should we blame the actions of central banks? Should we blame the fiscal authorities? Is it something deeper, deeper? Uh, inverted quotes because it might not exist, but like Austrian business cycle theory, Marxist
Hmm.
theory is what I'm speaking about. They tend to look for like a deeper cause than just policy at the time. Um, so there is room for reasonable debate about a question like that, and you can imagine, getting monetarist Keynesian answers or whatever, even within the mainstream tradition, if you ask that to students, and there would be ways of presenting each of those that would be valid. And I think, my answer to how to do it is always that every other social science and humanities does it. They all have those questions. I've taken political theory classes, I've taken history classes, and they just that those exam questions are just their bread and butter. That's just normal, right? You go in, you might answer a few descriptive questions, but most of the time it's just essays. And I mean, the department did well. The ways they got back at me, because I became a PhD student later, within Manchester, and I got on with everyone just fine, but personally, but one of the ways I feel like they kind of got back at me was when they did introduce essay questions. They made me mark them all. So one of the big barriers was that there are so many economics students, and it is genuinely difficult to mark essay questions compared to anywhere else in the Arthur Lewis building. You've got far more students in that degree. So if you're doing like I don't know what the courses are called, is it 10141 microeconomics, or I think the first ones, the introductory
Micro one.
ones.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. You might have like 800 students or something
Yeah.
absolutely absurd. The lecture's actually split into two, and I remember teaching on it. And I did a lecture, and then yeah, you have to do the same lecture twice in the biggest rooms in the university, and yeah, it's a lot of essays to mark, and you can't ask for the level of critical thinking that you would like. And this is a perennial problem in higher education, right? It's like at Oxbridge, you have a personal tutor. So the level of critical thinking you'll get at Oxbridge is just leaps and bounds above almost anywhere else, right? Because you get that personalized feedback
Hmm.
every week, constant pressing, do better, discussing it with them. So there is this constraint, but nevertheless, we were able to implement essay questions. And in the smaller courses as well, economic history, economics of public policy, we had like essay questions as well, which I think they're good because they get the student to think for themselves, to learn to articulate their arguments about a particular policy or historical event, why they think it happened, how they think it, could be improved or could have been avoided. And we have done it. So although it is a pain to mark, as I discovered, it's absolutely within the realms of the possible.
Awesome. And before I change topics, I kind of wanted to talk briefly about the Econocracy. Um, so could you provide like an overview of what like the book is and what people would take from reading it?
Yeah, I mean, to sum up the sort of elevator pitch, I'd say the book is an argument that economics is of great importance in
Mhm.
our society because of the position it occupies in public debate, the role of economists, the amount of economists that are employed by governments as well as by the private sector and the third sector. It seems that economics is extremely influential. And yet at the time, and still arguably today, we argued that the training of these economists and the ideas that are dominant in economics are not fit for purpose. And so, therefore, we have this econocracy where economics is extremely dominant, but it's detached from the public. It's a kind of ivory tower thing, a technocratic thing. The general public don't feel like they can engage with economics. They don't feel like they understand it, and economists don't really do any work to bridge that gap at all. And it's also, very monolithic, and it's dogmatic and rigid in the set of ideas that it does follow. Central banks kind of have a specific policy about inflation targeting, and there's been debate about changing that. It's still the same policy. When you've seen this with the cost of living crisis, when inflation goes up, they raise interest rates, and that's all they really know how to do. And arguably, it's not that good a policy, especially during a cost of living crisis, because it's probably the main cost faced by families. And I've had people come to me and say like, why, when the cost of living is really high, is the number one response to increase the cost of living? And the answer is, well, it does reduce inflation in some kind of aggregate sense, but it hurts a lot of people, right? So that type of debate over the distributional effects of such a policy, whether we could pursue something different, I think is one that still really needs to be opened up. And the fact that central banks are insulated from democratic politics is one reason that it isn't. And the fact that economists are so narrow in the way they conceptualize inflation and unemployment, I think is another reason. So I think that's a good example of like why the econocracy is an important idea, and how, you know, the ideas used within the econocracy aren't necessarily as good as they could be.
I agree, and I think that you reminded me how this one of our previous guests, so a professor at the university, he mentioned a really interesting point. He said you have to ask who benefits from the curriculum, in the sense that, do you believe that having a neoclassical dominated curriculum generally benefits people who wouldn't need government intervention as much as someone who might benefit more from it? For example, someone who's relying on food banks will need more government intervention, and a curriculum that, for example, suggests that higher intervention is bad for the economy is a political choice as much as a, convenient one.
Yeah. I mean, people will have completely different perspectives on it, right? What another dividing line, rich and poor, is a really important one, and I think the study of poverty was often omitted, and the idea of how poverty could affect you was often omitted from these economic ideas. I think another divide is like between men and women, right? So men and women are shown to have different policy preferences. Generally, women are more in favor of what's called government intervention, which I think, by the way, is already a bit of a biased term, because it assumes that, you know, the market exists and is sort of not a creation of the government, and is natural and is sort of eternal in a way. But yeah, men and women have different policy preferences. Statistics like GDP, they tend to count, you know, work done in the market economy, which is disproportionately by men. And then you know, unpaid care work and home work at home, household production, as economists call it, isn't necessarily counted in GDP. And so just some of these subtle biases, right, can reframe how you see the economy, and what you see, what policies you see a need for, and how you see like progress. So there's efforts from people like the Women's Budget Group, I think, to try and incorporate housework into like GDP, and it really changes your conclusions, right? So yeah, I mean, there's so many different dimensions, and I think one of the problems with some economists is that and I think this is more of an older generation thing than a younger generation thing. The younger economists I see coming through give me cause for hope. I mean, they usually, I say young, they're usually the same age as me, right? But the younger academics, and um, they the sort of old guard tend to think that economics is just economics, and that's just, you just learn it, you know, and it's just supply and demand, utility maximization, production functions, and it's just sort of, you know, objective in a sense, and you just need to get familiar with the tools, and the tools can be applied in any way to come to any conclusion. And I just don't think they see these subtle biases at all.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And on that note, when you're talking about the kind of different generation of economists, there's an interesting kind of thing I wanted to ask you regarding. So the post-crash society was founded on the basis of we're not learning enough about the financial crisis and like issues surrounding that, and that was a recession, and affected a lot of people. And then 10 years down the line, we had COVID, which was arguably a recession almost just as big or bigger in some cases, because it impacted everyone. Do you think the demands we have from our education has changed based on this new kind of circumstance we're in?
It's a really good question. I mean, I've wondered about this, because I always think of the name post crash, and you sort of, as time goes on, you're asking which crash.
Mm-hmm.
It's all depressingly always relevant, right? And I think for me, The financial crisis, I think, was something that would I would directly blame economists for. Not only economists, by the way, but they would share some of the blame, partially because some of their ideas, including inflation targeting, as well as financial deregulation, the efficient markets hypothesis, I think contributed to this notion that finance can sort of be trusted to do its thing and it doesn't really need to be regulated, or we don't need to have it in our macroeconomic models and stuff. And economists did occupy positions of power in the run up to the financial crisis. So I do think they share some direct responsibility. With COVID, less so. You know, yeah, could there have been more interdisciplinarity between economics and medicine, between economics and epidemiology? Yeah, for sure. I think so. But I, I I don't really see a direct line between the pandemic and economists the same way I do between the financial crisis and economists. One thing to say though is I think the fallout of the pandemic was maybe another instance where it exposed some of economists' blind spots. So you had things like the supply chain crisis,
Hmm.
and I think there, you'll be taught presumably still about like comparative advantage and the gains from trade and specialization and everything in your, introductory or intermediate economics classes. And I just don't think that most of the work on trade considered things like a pandemic and considered how fragile supply chains actually were. And I mean, there are things like, we've realized as a world that we get most of our microchips from not just from Taiwan, but from TMSC, one company in
Hmm.
Taiwan produces most of our microchips. And like, you know, I mean, you shouldn't get most of your anything from one place, I don't think. But also, Taiwan's geopolitically kind of unstable. It's also in an earthquake zone. It's just like, and then obviously it was very near to ground zero for the pandemic. So you've got these fragilities, and I economists weren't talking about what you can call resilience, right? They're very focused on efficiency. Can we squeeze the most out? Can we get the most output? Right. And if you had, like, say, a kind of slightly rubbish semiconductor manufacturing plant in the USA before 2020, economists would be like, no, shut it down. It's inefficient. But it's like, well, okay, yeah, maybe it's not as good as the Taiwanese one or the Dutch one, but it's there in case, they encounter problems. And this is like, I mean, the human body is a really good example. We have a lot of redundancy built in. We don't really need two kidneys,
Hmm.
right? But you can survive without one. But the problem is, if you've got one and anything goes wrong with it and then you're absolutely screwed. And I think that's the kind of philosophy we need to build into our economies. Which is not something that economists were drawing attention to. And it's like finance before 2008. Supply chains, yes, there were economists that studied it, of course. Did students learn about it? Was it center stage in the most core economic models? Were the economists that studied it widely known? I don't think so. And now there's a bit of a reckoning with that. But I see a lot of focus on these core models, which are kind of abstract and anodyne, in over a kind of. I mean, if you just ask someone in business before 2020 about supply chain fragility, they tell you they know about it. And this is the thing:
Hmm.
economists don't talk to anyone except themselves. So what this is a very roundabout way of just saying, look, I think there were things that were exposed by the pandemic. The pandemic itself, I don't think necessarily a direct problem for economics, but every few years we seem to encounter some kind of problem where economists are like, oh, we should have been looking at that. And they always seem to be one step behind, kind of fighting the last war. And, between 2008 and 2020, they were going, oh, well, we are incorporating finance into our models. And it's like, yeah, you are now after the bad thing happened, but what about doing it before? What about warning? And economists just they very rarely seem to be able to warn credibly about future threats. And I'm not talking about predicting exactly when it's going to happen. I'm talking about building a system so that it can withstand it.
Before we dive into the moral pluralism and the kind of different approaches, I wanted to kind of talk a bit about. So I ask this to everyone, and it's kind of interesting to see the different answers people come up with. If you were to hold a dinner party and you could invite 2 or 3 economists from all over history, they could be alive, they could be dead. Who would be on your list?
I think I would have Joan Robinson. She was very sharp, great writer, really incisive, independent thinker, following by and large in the tradition of Keynes, but she was like one of the only women in Cambridge in her time, right? And she was, yeah, she was tough. She was as tough as you had to be to get into that position, you know, during the 50s. Um, Another one would probably be Eleanor Ostrom. I think so she was kind of. It's difficult to place her. I'm pretty sure her PhD was in political science, and she can get her research engaged in what I would consider to be anthropology, studying different societies and how they manage the so-called tragedy of the commons. But then she ended up winning the Nobel Prize in economics. So the only way I can think of her is a social scientist, right? She was very broad, very interdisciplinary. By all accounts, quite a lot of fun as well. Didn't, took her work seriously, didn't take herself too seriously. So I reckon she'd be good at a dinner party. Um, and God, how many am I allowed? 3.
Yeah.
Okay, 3. All right. Um, and I think probably probably Amartya Sen as well. Yeah, I just I have a lot of respect for him and his work, and I think he would bring a different perspective to that table of people. Yeah, there you go.
It's like picking like a dream team in like FIFA. Um,
Yeah.
I want to add one more character to that list
Yeah.
from The Simpsons because I know you really like your Simpsons memes.
Yeah.
What character would you invite to your dinner party?
God. Okay, well you couldn't have Lisa because it'd be too much, it'd be too serious.
A party full of economists, that is.
A party full of it'd be way too academic. You need someone who's a little bit more fun. Um I'm gonna say Marge, actually, because I think that she would listen and it would be interesting. I can't imagine inviting any of the others because they talk too much in the main Simpsons family. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I definitely I think Marge would be a really good guest. I think she'd be very interesting and respectful.
I think I'd agree with that. Bart would be a definite no.
You can't have Bart, no.
But what about Homer? What would he do?
Well, yeah, I don't know, but he'd do something awful, surely, and embarrassing. It's by process of elimination that Marge gets in there. I mean, maybe Maggie as well. Um,
Mhm. So okay, that was fun. Now back to the depressing stuff. Um, from all the kind of main classical economists, who do you think is the most misunderstood? So for instance, with Keynes, there's so many kind of interpretations of his work, and similar with Adam Smith. So you think it's like, as a society, we're not like, yeah, the most misunderstood classical economist.
I mean, it's got to be Marx, right? I think Marx is the most
Mm-hmm.
misunderstood. And there are good reasons for that and bad reasons for that. I think Marxists kind of relish in the various misunderstandings and complications that come from the fact that basically he wasn't that great a writer in economics and capital is unfinished, so they're just filling in the gaps and getting angry at each other for getting it wrong. But at the same time, if you read anything written by any mainstream economist, not to mention like kind of American conservatives about Marx, it's just completely wrong. I mean, I think it was Banerjee and Dufflo, right, who They received the Nobel Prize in 2019, I think, that they're for their work on RCTs. And there's a footnote in their book. Was it good? Uh, is it Good Economics for Hard Times? Um, there's a footnote in their book that says something like, contrary to what Karl Marx thought, labor is not just an ordinary commodity. And I just can't understand how you could possibly write that. These are two Nobel Prize winning economists. It just shows you how little economists know about Marx. Obviously, the whole point of Marxism is that labor isn't like any other commodity. That's the whole point of the labor theory of value, right? That's the foundation of his analysis. And like the amount of statements I see about Marx, and I can't. Like Jordan Peterson, in his debate with Slavoj Žižek, mumbled a bunch of stuff about Marx after reading just the Communist Manifesto, and it was just ridiculous. I can't remember the specifics, but he said like Marx didn't consider nature or something, which is completely wrong. And take your pick. You can find so much misunderstanding over Marx. Like I said, Marx, not a fully finished set of ideas, bit of a turgid writer when it came to economics, the later Marx. So there are good reasons for that, but there aren't good reasons for the level of misunderstanding. And economists just, I wish them of all people, maybe I don't expect anything from Jordan Peterson, but economists need to have a better understanding of him, at least a baseline understanding.
And you mentioned the theory of value. So on that note, obviously, like back in the day, um, the means of production would be like not, and everyone could own the means of production. So like it was kind of like not inevitable, but it was very common for labor to get exploited. In the 21st century now, anyone can kind of, to an extent, start their own business. Like they have more bargaining power. You can learn skills much faster, or much skills are much more like accessible nowadays. Would you say labor is still being exploited, or in our kind of current system? Do you think that's like there's like a downward kind of trend there?
I mean, I think the standard Marxist answer would be that the sort of labor aristocracy of the global north is not being exploited in the same way, but the laborers in the global south, in Foxconn making iPhones or whatever, they are
Mm-hmm.
being exploited in basically, the very sort of classical Marxist way. But that doesn't answer the direct question of what exactly is going on in richer economies, I don't think. And I don't think notions of Marxist exploitation necessarily have a good answer for that. I do think that, like all things classical political economy, as well as GDP, to be honest, and a lot of our economic theories, that it kind of applies better to manufacturing than anything else. You can see very much, the value added in manufacturing, right, is very easy to measure. Once you start trying to measure services, you just sort of end up making things up. And it's like there's this big debate over, what counts as productive labor, and what can actually be exploited. Where does the labor theory of value apply? I don't know that Marxism really has that much interesting to say about that. Having said that, in terms of, if you allow me to use my own definition of exploited,
Mm-hmm.
then yeah, I think laborers are being exploited all over the place, and I think that exploitation for me is largely about choice, and do you have the bargaining power to take an outside option, to take another option. And if you look at a lot of people who are working even in richer countries in hospitality, the gig economy, or other sort of other low paid jobs, then they don't really have much of an outside option. So I think in that sense they are being exploited, right? Because their employer can extract more out of them than they reasonably could if they were able to tell their employer to F off, right? So I mean that's my very basic definition of exploitation that I think is, would be extremely unsatisfactory to a Marxist. And exploitation has a very specific meaning to a Marxist. It has to be said. It's not necessarily the same as what I was, as the kind of thing I was getting at there. But yeah, like I think that labor's exploited, whether it is under Marxist theory in the global north. Um, maybe not, but I just think it varies. It will vary depending on which Marxist you ask, to be honest with you.
to shed light on the libertarian perspective, because like
Hmm.
whenever I see this debate happening, the libertarian would always respond with the idea of risk, like, you know,
Mm.
um, for example, owners of factories and businesses, they're taking on a bigger risk. Therefore, they should um kind of get a bigger piece of the pie. And in today's economy, there's like this idea of individual choice. What are your thoughts on that? Like, I mean, don't we have individual choice to kind of um make decisions that lead up to kind of how much bargaining power we'll have by the time we're 20, 30, 40?
I mean, I don't. I mean, we make choices in a context, right? This is the issue, right? So the one way I think of it, to put it in very Econ 101 e consumer theory terms, if you imagine the choices versus the choice set, the question is who determines the choice set? How do I know? How does what I'm choosing from, how does that get determined? And the answer to me is much broader forces beyond the individual political forces, right? And it's the simple question that everyone's asked. Why does a private school rich kid have so many choices, whereas someone born in a child born in the Democratic Republic of Congo doesn't, right? You have different choices depending on the political and economic situation. So yeah, you can make choices within that context, but I think the far bigger determinant factor is these overarching sort of macro dynamics, and those are a much bigger determinant of income. I mean, like am I don't know, 1,000 times more productive than someone in the global south? I don't think so, but I earn like 1,000 times more than them, right?
Mhm.
So that's just a really simple response. I mean, in terms of risk, I mean, in one way, you're kind of conflating a lot of things, and I don't blame you because this is what libertarians do, right? So there's this kind of normative argument for choice that's freedom, and then there's this more consequentialist thing about whether it produces a good outcome to allow people to have that choice, right? And they're actually two different things. And this notion of like it being a reward for risk, um, I don't know. You could argue the consequentialist interpretation, which is more that allowing people to take those risks and potentially lose their money leads to better outcomes in the long term, because that is, after all, the driving force of capitalism. And that's something that, to be honest, Marx kind of agreed on. But the question of whether the return to them is justified in some kind of intrinsic just desserts sense
Mhm.
is another argument entirely. And I actually don't really think it works, because it's not taking risk that gives you the return, it's the risk paying off, right? So you can't argue that taking risk is inherently worthy or productive, because not everybody who takes risks gets paid off. It's only when the risk actually turns out to make money. So I don't, then it's like it changes to, okay, so only the people who take risks where the risk pays off get money, but that's not, they usually say just taking risk. So I don't think taking risk in itself is something that necessarily justifies returns. I mean, that on that logic, like going to the casino is a productive activity. I don't know. They just doesn't seem right to me. And I think it's kind of funny actually, because one thing that both Marxism and libertarianism struggle with, and this will make both of them very angry, is loss. Um, because often when you're talking about exploitation and the generation of surplus value, it's kind of assumed that the capitalist makes money. And in the same way, when libertarians are talking about the taking on of risk, it's kind of assumed that people make money. And I don't think either of those frameworks, for different reasons, can deal with loss very well. But I don't know how much we want to get into. It might be getting a bit theoretical for a podcast. I don't know.
And as a final question on this topic, I was really keen to hear your thoughts on Doughnut Economics and the idea of kind of changing the goal of the economy itself.
Yeah, I think the donut is a genius intervention. I think Kate Raworth's really great, and she's been very supportive of like post crash and rethinking and everything ever since the start. And she's a really great speaker. You should get her on, because I had her on my channel, and she uses lots of visual um what are they called? I'm blanking. Begins with P. Anyway, the props,
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 okay.
visual props. So she's got like all sorts of colorful visual props, and they're actually really helpful for illustrating her point. But the donut's been so successful. I mean, I think it's amazing how many cities have adopted it as a strategy of kind of keeping, our economic consumption and energy usage and, other various other environmental thresholds and categories, keeping that within certain bounds, while tending to everybody's needs. It's just it's a really neat idea. It's kind of a simple idea. I don't think Kate. I think Kate would admit she might not have been the first to come up with it, but she certainly put it into a really digestible form and popularized it. And it seems to be having a massive impact, more so than most ideas in economics, mainstream or heterodox. So I'm really happy because, climate change now is the single biggest challenge we face, and, it's happening, and we need to kind of do whatever we can to ameliorate it and manage it and try to reduce emissions and other throughputs as fast as possible. So yeah, I mean, I do just think the donuts is an idea, to aspire to be that influential with an idea in economics. I think is something that not many ideas reach that level at all. A very small percentage of them do.
So as I mentioned, every kind of episode we have this tradition where the last guest asks a question for the next one without knowing who that person is.
Okay.
And then you're gonna have to ask one for the next guest too. So Paul Middleditch, macroeconomics professor, he was our last guest. So this is his question: where do you see the future of course design in higher education in 20 years? How will we be teaching? Where will we be teaching? And what will we be teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. Paul didn't know it was me. Is that okay? So, I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is we're going to see more online stuff, right? And it, look at what we're doing, the growth of like YouTube. I think more lecturers are still using Zoom or some kind of pre-recorded um, materials. I hope it will get more sophisticated than it was during COVID, because I taught online in COVID and it was awful because you were just basically, it's just a camera straight to your face and you're just talking a room that you can't really interact with. So the Open University obviously have a lot of resources for doing that properly. And I do think we'll see a growth. Maybe, I don't know if it will be that existing institutions change versus maybe organizations like the OU expanding and other ones kind of cropping up and
Mm-hmm.
they just taking up more space. I think that I think universities need to do that um, to keep up with the times, because I think a lot of people are just watching YouTube or whatever instead. And as a YouTuber, I have to say, like, it's not always a reliable source of information. And I wouldn't recommend people, watch my channel or any other instead of an actual accredited university degree, for all their flaws. They are still much more credible and reliable. So, yeah, I think universities need to keep up with that, right? They need to offer that type of content. In terms of just so that's one answer, but in terms of just in the classroom, um, I mean, I think we're discovering more about pedagogy every day. I think it's been neglected how students actually learn. And one thing that I've learned recently-ish in the past couple of years is, for example, most university courses, they still do lecture tutorial. Now, that's actually quite a bad way to teach people, because if you just drone on at them for 2 hours, aside from the fact that most academics, sorry, aren't very good at lecturing, but even if you put that to one side, if you just throw information at people for that long, and that's their first encounter with the course, here's the history of the Mongolian Empire. they're not really going to absorb it. Maybe if you're a really good lecturer or they already just love the subject, but they're not going to absorb it. What you have to do is the reverse: tutorial lecture, tutorial lecture. You have to get them to try to do something, the students, go with their intuitions, realize the gaps in their knowledge, be corrected by their peers or the teacher, and realize, oh shit, this is what I need to
Mm.
learn, and then go and learn it in the lecture, right? So I think, again, this is a hope rather than a prediction. I hope just simple things like that are going to be used more by universities as they develop a bit more. That fosters a more collaborative environment as well, automatically, right? Because now the students feel like they're a part of the learning process and they know why they're there, and the lecturer can respond to, what didn't people know in the tutorials. So I think that type of thing, that two-way interaction, and changing, the order that we do things, which is so dated,
Mm-hmm.
and not by tens of years, it's dated by hundreds of years. There's no reason to be doing a kind of chalk and talk thing in most cases now. So yeah, I think hopefully we'll incorporate those kind of pedagogical concerns a bit better, and the students will feel more involved.
So yeah, finally, what's your question for the next guest, whoever that may be?
My question for the next guest, it would be, what thing do you think that economists are currently neglecting that will come to bite them in the bum in the future, like they were neglecting finance before 2008, like they were neglecting supply chains and health before the pandemic?
What would your answer be to that question?
My own answer,
Yeah.
um, it's probably still climate change, to be honest, is the boring answer, because they are. I don't think the economics of climate change forms a big enough part of what economists do, and I don't think what's there is especially satisfactory. So although everybody knows about climate change, I don't think economists are dealing with it well enough. Did Paul also answer his own question, or?
Yeah. And finally, what's one thing? So, if say a viewer didn't listen to the whole podcast, they were going to jump straight to the conclusion. What's one thing you think you want them to take home with them?
Just stay critical of what you're taught, and never take it at face value, no matter whether it seems kind of rigorous or scientific, and always look for alternative perspectives. Doesn't mean the alternative perspectives are definitely right, but either way, it will sharpen your thinking to know about and contrast them.
Cahal, it's been an absolutely fruitful chat with you.
Thank you very much.
So thank you for joining us today.